Why did medieval knights wear crests on their helmets? And actually, did they? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now this might seem like a really simple question. Why did knights wear heraldic crests on top of their helmets? And in fact, if you type this into Google or any other search engine like DuckDuckGo or whatever, you will get a whole bunch of answers. Now the standard answer to this question, why did medieval knights, this is one of my helmets by the way, why did medieval knights wear crests on their helmet? The standard answer is, as armour developed and it became harder for knights to recognise each other on the battlefield, heraldry evolved so that they could recognise each other and know friend from foe. And the crest is part of this, and obviously there's an advantage to being on top of your helmet, because in the press and in the melee you might not be able to see someone's tabard or surcoat, the thing they wear on their body which has their heraldry on it. And the crest sticks up in the air, and so you'd be able to tell friend from foe. And this is why the crest developed. Well, first of all, we can definitely agree that the crest did develop. The crest was a real thing. But was it actually worn? We'll come back to that in a second. The crest was worn on top of the helmet, and in fact we do find various helmets like this, including great helms, great bassinets, various types of frog-mouthed helmet, things like this that have holes on the top. In fact, this has a hole there. There we go, and various others for mounting heraldic crests to. Now, here's the elephant in the room. There is a problem to having a crest on top of your helmet. This is a fairly heavy object. Now, when you put armour on, and it doesn't really matter whether we're talking about earlier periods, so we're talking about the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries where we're predominantly wearing mail, commonly known as chainmail, or as we start to get plate coming in towards the end of the 13th and into the 14th centuries and all the way through the 14th. And by the end of the 14th century, we've got basically a full plate harness, and then through the 15th century most knights, if we call them that, are wearing full plate harness. Now, one of the problems is that makes you heavier. It certainly protects you very well, but it makes you heavier and changes your centre of gravity a bit. And helmets are, I have to say, or at least can be, disproportionately heavy compared to the other armour. So generally speaking, limb armour, arms and legs, is relatively light, relatively thin. The really thickest parts of armour are helmets and breastplates, or cuirass. Okay, generally speaking, the backplate is thinner than the breastplate, but in terms of jousting or in terms of walking towards people shooting arrows and crossbow bolts at you and people hitting you with stuff, it's most important to have a thick helmet, particularly up here and at the front, and a thick breastplate. And so for this reason, if we look at the original thicknesses of armour surviving archaeologically and in museums and armouries, if we measure it, it's often very much thicker up here or up here on the front of the breastplate than it is, for example, on the pauldrons of the shoulders or the cuisses over the thighs of the legs and things like this. So you often end up with quite a high centre of gravity. Now, there are a couple of really big problems with sticking in fact, three really big problems with sticking a big crest on top of your helmet. Firstly, it exacerbates that problem. Okay, so adding any weight, and crests are normally made of wood, leather, papier-mâché equivalent type stuff, so they're not hugely heavy. They're not as heavy as the actual helmet itself or anything like that, but they do add a weight on top of the head. So they exacerbate the problem of weight on your head and your centre of gravity. That's the first thing. The second thing is, they're really easy to grab. Okay, so grappling and wrestling is really common in armoured fighting, and we see it in all of the Fechtbook or fighting manuals, treatises of the time, where grabbing someone by the helmet is a major thing. Now, if they've got a great big crest sticking on top of their helmet, this is fairly difficult to grab. What do you grab? You try and get the visor open and get in there, but there's not much here to grab. It's fairly smooth because it's designed to have deflective surfaces and not be easy to manipulate. You stick a great big crest on the top, and the crest acts like a handle, essentially. Now, another issue, and you might have guessed from my mention of deflection there, is if you add a great big crest on top of your helmet, you're taking this beautifully designed thing, designed for things to glance off and slide off, and you're creating a capturing device on top of your head that is going to direct things straight towards your head and have, you know, if someone swings a poleaxe at your head, it's more likely to stick on that helmet and all of that energy to go into your helmet, which is not nice for you. So yes, indeed, while the crest could be fantastic for identification on the battlefield, you can see hopefully already just by going through a few examples, and there are others, already there are a few inherent problems with putting a crest on your helmet in war. Okay, now the next question is, did they actually do that? Well, here's the thing. If you start looking through medieval manuscripts or even things like stained glass windows and other forms of art available to us from the time, you will very quickly find that in battlefield scenes, people don't normally wear crests. Probably for all of the reasons I just mentioned, but there are also some other smaller reasons which I'll get to in a second. So generally speaking, it actually seems that knights didn't wear crests on the battlefield, but we know that crests existed, and in fact crests even down to the modern day. I mean, in my family, one branch of my family has a coat of arms with a crest on it. We know that heraldic crests are a real thing, and they definitely existed. So when were they worn? The simple answer, without beating around the bush, is tournaments. Okay, so by and large, crests were a tournament thing. They were worn in jousts. They were sometimes worn in combats on foot with poleaxes, although we have images of combats on foot with poleaxe where they're not wearing crests. So sometimes for certain pageantry reasons, people wore crests because it's a bit like Manchester United wearing red or Chelsea wearing blue. It's so that the people watching can tell who is who. Now you might argue, well, doesn't that work on the battlefield as well? But I think the problem is the inherent disadvantages of the crest outweigh the advantages, and so they weren't generally worn on the battlefield. Now, I will hear some of you cry, oh, but I've seen medieval art which shows knights on the battlefield wearing a crest sometimes, occasionally. There's actually not a huge number of examples. So the answer is yes, perhaps you could have a very high status individual, a king, the commander, the main commander, the general essentially of the army might wear a crest so that it's easier to see them, but they might not necessarily be in frontline fighting. And so long as the majority of knights don't have crests on top of their helmet, overall it's not going to be a military disadvantage. So generally speaking, the king can have something fancy on their head. But here's the thing, we actually know what kings wore on their heads because they survive on some helmets and in written records. And Henry V famously had his damaged at the Battle of Agincourt, and that is a crown or coronet, actually sometimes attached permanently and sometimes removable to the helmet. In other words, a gold or gilt, usually brass crown, could even be solid gold crown on the helmet. So therefore they weren't wearing a crest. So in these cases, we actually know that certain very high nobles had their helmets decorated to show that they were the king or the duke or whoever they were, but they weren't wearing a crest. Yet again, it's more evidence that they weren't really wearing crests in battle. But if you're saying, oh, well, I looked at a medieval manuscript where they were wearing crests on the top, this might be artistic license, because artists usually, maybe not always, but usually don't go to war. This isn't the modern world where we have roving reporters on the battlefield in their flak jackets. No, instead, this would be an artist back in the civilian world, basing the armour in their illustration on what they know, which often is a tournament. And many, many military scenes in medieval art are painted and illustrated in the manner of a tournament. So when Arthur and his knights are fighting the enemies that they do in so many of those medieval manuscripts, it is shown like a tournament with the crests, because that's what the commoners back in civilian world actually see people, knights, fighting with, is with a crest on top. So finally, I will say, you will be saying, well, why has my helmet got holes in the top here? Well, you have to remember that 15th century helmets, be it a great bassinet like this or even a sallet, might sometimes be intended for multiple purpose. So this helmet is a type of helmet that was very popular for tournaments, for tournament fighting. But that doesn't mean it wouldn't be taken to war. So this helmet, sans without the crest attached, worn in war, and then if you want to wear it for a poleaxe combat, then you use those holes to bolt on your crest, and boom, you've got a tournament helmet. So sometimes these helmets were multiple purpose. So I could go into a lot more little detail about various of the things that I've touched on here, but fundamentally crests were a thing that were invented pretty much in the, I think they appear first in the probably 12th century, the very earliest ones, and they are something that seem to have a particular rise in popularity, particularly in tournaments, in the 13th century, and we see them in various manuscripts in a tournament setting, and we still see them in a tournament setting in the 16th and 17th century. They were worn for tournaments all the way through, but for war, they are not shown on knights' helmets very often at all in any century. It doesn't matter whether you go earlier or later. And when they are shown, remember, it might be artistic reasons, or it could just be an outlier. It could be that that one person, for some reason, wanted to have something fancy on their helmet. And there are simpler things than crests. We do occasionally see a gold ball with plumes out of it, which obviously doesn't have the weight or grabbing or deflection problems that a massive great crest does. So there are things you can stick on your helmet, just like some feathers, which aren't going to create the same problem that a true heraldic crest does. Anyway, I hope this has been interesting. I have been Matt Easton. I will of course continue to be, and hopefully I'm going to see all of you back on the channel really soon. So remember to subscribe so you know about the next video straight away. Cheers for watching, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.